purpose of my talk today is to outline the three major trends affecting central cities in the United States. The first trend has been the decentralization of population, and particularly the middle-class population out of the central cities into the suburbs. The second trend is the decentralization or out-movement of manufacturing employment to the suburbs. And a third trend is the substitution of service jobs for manufacturing jobs as our economic base in the central cities. So I will go through each of these points in turn. Although the middle-class population began to decentralize out of the central cities before World War II, the flood of movement didn't occur until after the war ended. The reasons were both due to market forces and government policy. First, an important reason for the decentralization of population was the deteriorating living conditions in our central cities. Traffic congestion, crowded living conditions, and pollution made many city neighborhoods unattractive and unhealthy living environments. Moreover, our environmental laws were lax, and factories were often located next to residential neighborhoods. This further contributed to the push of middle-class families out of the city. In contrast, the suburbs promised cleaner, cooler air and open spaces. While families may have wanted to move out of the city for decades, it was the rising incomes that occurred during and after World War II that made such a move possible. During the war, the economy reached full employment. Men and women alike went to work to support the war effort. Due to wartime rationing, there were few consumer goods and few things for families to spend money on. further savings accumulated. By the time the war ended, families had savings to spend on housing as well as other consumer goods. From 1940 to 1960, disposable family income increased by more than 50%. Disposable income is the money a household has to spend after they pay their taxes. Families not only had money to spend on housing, but they had income to buy automobiles. Automobile ownership expanded the distance that individuals could live from their place of work, so that automobile ownership meant that a family could live in the suburbs and commute downtown to their place of work. With rising incomes, families also spent money on automobiles. During the war, men and women had delayed marriage and child rearing due to the war. And so after the war, a rising marriage and birth rate also contributed to the demand for new housing. Aside from rising incomes, rising automobile ownership, and the increase in marriages and birth rates, there were also several federal initiatives that encouraged the middle class to leave the central cities. A first program was the Federal Highway Act. The Federal Highway Act put a tax on gasoline so that every time anyone buys a gallon of gasoline, they pay a tax. That tax was allocated to new road building. So that there was a huge pool of money to build new roads. This meant that our roads expanded rapidly around the cities and between cities. As roads improved, families could live further from their places of work and commute. So road building also made it possible for middle income families to move out of the cities to the suburbs. Remember during this time that employment was still centered in the central cities, so people were still attached to the central cities. They could live in the suburbs, but they had to come downtown. For their job. Another federal program that encouraged the out-migration of middle-income families was the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and VA, Veterans Administration programs. These two programs guaranteed loans that banks would make to homeowners. So, for example, if you're a homeowner and you participate in this program and you borrowed money from a bank, if you defaulted on your mortgage, the bank would be paid back by the federal government. This made banks very ready to make loans for mortgages. Also, mortgages were extended to 30 years, and often the down payment was only 5%. This program made a lot of mortgage money available to residents, and it made home ownership extremely affordable. Moreover, it encouraged moves to the suburbs because it was in the suburbs that you could own a home. In the central cities, you primarily had to rent. In 1950, 57% of the urban population lived in the central cities. So in 1950, more than half of our urban populations were located in the down in the central parts of the city. Today, less than 35% of urban residents live in the central cities. Moreover, for the incomes of our central city residents, the average income of central city residents has gone down as middle income families have moved out. For example, 16% of central city residents fall into the poverty category, while only 7% of suburban residents are poor. A second major trend to affect central cities is the loss of manufacturing employment. In 1950, about 37% of manufacturing employment in urban areas was located downtown. By 1990, more than 60% of our manufacturing employment that's in cities is located in the suburbs. Leaving less than 40% of manufacturing employment downtown. We can see that if you drive through cities, you can see lots of vacant land in the industrial areas of our older cities. There are also a number of reasons for the out movement or out migration of manufacturing. One reason is that plants began to move out to follow the labor force. As the labor force moved out to the suburbs, manufacturing plants often began to find shortages of labor, and so they moved out to follow the labor force. The second major factor was that trucking began to replace rail as the major mode of moving products around the country. Rail stations are located in the downtown, so when manufacturing shipped by rail, they needed to be downtown near the rail station. But as the highway system expanded and the internal combustion engine improved, more and more goods are now shipped by truck. The highway system expanded for the same reason I mentioned before in terms of households, is due to the Federal Highway Act. Trucking is cheaper and far more flexible than rail routes. As a consequence, the new optimal location for manufacturing is on the beltways and on the highways on the fringe of the city. Trucks that have to get from downtown to out to the highway find there's a lot of congestion, and particularly during rush hour, and they don't like to be downtown anymore. A third reason for the movement of manufacturing to the suburbs is the shift of production processes from more small-scale manufacturing to large assembly line production. When you have an assembly line, production is done on large conveyor belts, and you need large amounts of land and space for that kind of production. So if you think about an automobile plant, they need a lot of land and a lot of space to move cars through conveyor belts. Land is cheaper on the fringe of the city, so that was another attraction for the suburbs. And moreover, as manufacturing shifted to assembly line, they often couldn't even find the land available in the downtown. So that was a third factor for encouraging manufacturing to move out. And a final reason for a loss of manufacturing employment in the central cities is that manufacturing is declining overall nationally. Manufacturing employment is declining. Manufacturing production processes are now more efficient, so we use fewer workers per unit of output, and so manufacturing employment is down overall. And that's particularly hit the central cities hard, as they both have the out-migration of employment and then also experience these national losses on top of it. These two trends are of concern because there is a steady loss of business and middle-income residents in our cities to pay taxes. As the tax base is eroded, central city governments have a more difficult time raising the revenues they need to pay for city services. And to educate the next generation. Central city governments, such as the City of Baltimore and Washington, D.C., are unable to reach the tax base of their wealthier suburban neighbors. A consequence for our central cities is very high tax burdens, which then further discourage high-income residents and businesses from locating in the central city. And just to give you an example, in Baltimore, the City of Baltimore spends about $3,000 per child on education. At the same time, they have a 6% tax rate. In Montgomery County, our tax rate is about 2.3%, much lower. And on that lower tax rate, we raise more revenue, and we can spend about $5,500 per child on education. One countervailing trend has been the growth of the service sector. In the last decade, 9 of every 10 new jobs was in the service sector. Now, 2/3 of our labor force works in services. Services, especially advanced services, what we call producer services like banking, legal services, publishing, advertising, software development, architects, insurance, and accounting are examples of advanced services. And these services prefer to concentrate in the dense central cities. The reason that the service sector has grown so rapidly are numerous. A couple of reasons are that one is that manufacturing employment or manufacturing production now requires a lot more services per unit of output produced. So, for example, you may have noticed when you look at cars now that automobile ads are much more specifically targeted to particular demographic groups. So if you think about back to the Model T, there was one car, and it was the same car produced for everybody. Now GM and Ford, Chrysler, they all target very specific market niches. So for example, they target 18 to 24-year-old singles who think that they're swingers and that they need a fancy car. And they have another car for people who are 45 to 55, whose children are grown and who have an income of 50,000 and above. So because manufacturing has gotten so specific to market niches, they require a lot of services to help market these products and to help determine what the markets for these products are. They do a lot more research, a lot more advertising than they have in the past. And all of it. This requires very high specialized services. Other reasons for service